Welcome to the latest Gramophone Classical Music Podcast. I'm Martin Cullingford, editor of Gramophone, and today I am delighted to be joined by the violinist Rachel Barton Pine, whose new album, called Dependent Arising, is out today on the Cedille label. This week's podcast comes to you in association with the Lake George Music Festival, where from August the 6th to the 17th you can enjoy classical music among some of America's most spectacular scenery. Visit lakegeorgemusicfestival.com to find out more. Now, Rachel Barton Pine's new album pairs Shostakovich's Violin Concerto No. 1 with a new work written especially for her by Earl Maneein, called Dependent Arising, and which draws on her and his great love of heavy metal music. Though, as Rachel tells me, there's an initial link between the two, in that Shostakovich's music actually has a particular resonance for heavy metal audiences.
Yeah, there's something about it, the way the rhythmic patterns occur and shift. And then most importantly, its emotional content, the idea of oppression and despair and rage and, just all of this darkness, of course, with, the Soviet regime that he was living under, causing this continual fear, but also his defiance of that. All of those really, really strong and powerful, just this idea of resistance, I think is what characterizes a lot of, not the kind of party heavy metal, right? Like the, girls and debauchery, like that's not what we're talking about, but the darker types of heavy metal, like thrash metal, doom metal, death metal, all of those more serious genres really share that same emotional and frankly rhythmic aesthetic as Shostakovich. Of course, a lot of the great classical composers have been inspiring to metal artists along the way, but I also think there's something about life circumstances and certain parallels that inspire artists to create works that have the same resonance, even if they're separated by time and place. Well, good way to explain Shostakovich. I'm sure everybody's familiar with his eighth string quartet and can immediately recall bits of it to mind. If you think about the second movement of it, that's just this really driving, aggressive, just classic type of metal expression. But actually, the fourth movement, where three of the players are holding this long, ominous, very soft harmony. And then, of course, the knocking of the secret police, right? Da, 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 dun, dun, dun. That also has just as much of that, capturing that kind of sock to the gut. Metal obviously is amplified. It has certain classic instrumentation when you're talking about, drums and electric guitars. But really, you can take that type of music and transpose it anywhere. It's so interesting. A number of years ago, I was walking through the Musical Instrument Museum in Phoenix, Arizona, which has the most comprehensive collection of every type of instrument from every culture on the planet. And I happened to be listening to, seeing an example of and listening to the little recorded clip of this bowed stringed instrument from Mongolia. And I thought, oh my gosh, that thing feels so heavy metal. And not very many years later, a band emerged called the Who, the HU, and they actually combined that instrument with electric guitars and rock drums and are a Mongolian heavy metal band, which is brilliant. So, so this sound can come from anywhere, really.
And I think one thing I'm hopeful for is that whereas not so long ago music would largely have to be categorised so that people knew which bit of the shop or even which shop it went into, but actually something with streaming is that those borders are so much porous, and they ever will be, and perhaps people can explore those links in a fruitful and creative way. Is that something you've found in more recent years?
Yeah, well, definitely. What's been fascinating to me all through the decades, even long before streaming, is that there are a lot of really passionate music fans who love heavy metal and love classical, but never go to classical concerts. Because maybe they're these, working class guys, rock fans who just have this misconception that you have to dress up in a suit and tie and behave a certain way. Like going to a classical concert hall is like visiting the country club, and they don't quite feel comfortable. And so I've made it one of my missions, to, of course, try to introduce as many new audiences to classical as possible, and particularly these guys who are already, and I guys as a gender neutral term, but these people who are my fellow rock fans who are already listening to classical, to welcome them and invite them and tell them that we'd love to have them there. And there's nothing more gratifying than somebody coming up to you after a concert and saying, this was my very first time ever hearing an orchestra live and I loved it. And conversely, I've had some, fellow classical aficionados who have checked out my own bands. I had a band for a number of years called Earth and Grave, and I was playing a 6-string flying V electric violin, and it was absolutely straight up heavy metal, nothing classical about it. But knowing me and knowing that I had this band, people would check it out and then they would say, wow, that's actually good music. But I would be scared to ever go to one of those rock clubs where people are tattooed and banging into each other. And I'd say, oh, wait a sec, it's not as scary as all that. You should try it out. So it's interesting how the misconceptions go both ways, and people are a little intimidated by each other's world. But really, music is music, and the more good music, the better. And everybody should be welcomed everywhere. And I think they are once they give it a chance.
Now, let's look at this particular work by Earl Maneein, who's written it for you. And certainly initially, I was struck that the sound world did actually feel quite like the Shostakovich concerto that it follows on the recording. Was that deliberate, or does it just underpin what you were saying earlier about perhaps the Shostakovich's music and metal finding something shared in its approach?
Yeah, well, he wasn't specifically inspired by this particular Shostakovich concerto. I mean, he's, a conservatory trained, high level classical artist. He has his master's from the Manhattan School and, a regular classical career besides all his other extracurriculars. But so all of classical music, or much of classical music, is inspiring him, including, all the works of Shostakovich. But that being said, actually, this concerto was written as it is, and then when I wanted to record it, I decided which concerto to pair it with. So it was actually Maneein plus Shostakovich rather than Shostakovich plus Maneein. Of course, we put it Shostakovich first on the album because I think you have to start with the more classic thing and then the more radical thing in terms of the listener's journey. But the Shostakovich was the B-side, if you will, even though of course it was on my wish list. Actually, the big consideration that we had to figure out with the Maneein concerto is he's utilizing a lot of things that have never been combined with symphony orchestra before, like something called a blast beat, which is a particular type of drumming used specifically in death metal, where you're actually, rather than jump, which was more of a thrash metal type of drum beat, you're actually going like all in a row, which is a very technically difficult thing to do, actually, for those master drummers. But it's very characteristic, and we wanted to use it in this concerto because that was part of his vision. But the question is, how the heck do you do that? And we decided against using an actual rock drum kit, nothing amplified. This was going to be normal symphonic forces and a true classical piece, just like Bartók's violin concerto uses the rhythms and harmonies and melodies inspired by Hungarian folk music, but no folk music instruments or anything like that. So the rock drums kind of create this sort of cascade effect where they're actually too loud for an orchestra. So then you have to put them behind plexiglass and then the drummer can't hear anything, so then you have to put a monitor, which means you have to put mics on the other instruments, and then sometimes a good rock drummer isn't used to following a baton because they're used to being the one leading everything, and it just wasn't going to work. So Earl actually was genius the way that he created it. Took so much experimentation to try to recreate some of these drum kit sound effects using only the forces of symphonic timpani and percussion, and of course the winds and brass and everybody else. But yeah, so it was really breaking new ground, yet still, of course, one foot in the classical world as it's existed up till now. And so it's kind of like standing on the shoulders but going farther.
Yeah, no, I mean, I should say it's a really stunning performance from the Royal Scottish National Orchestra under Tito Muñoz. Listeners will be immediately reminded when they listen to it of the powerful extremes a symphony orchestra is capable of achieving, and it's fascinating to hear how you achieve some of those effects. I mean, it feels almost wrong to say it's replicating, if you like, the sound of metal music. It's more striving for the same end, and I think achieving it in a different sort of way.
Yeah, and I use playing rock favorites on the violin as a kind of outreach or community engagement to go on a rock radio station or to a pub and play some AC/DC, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and so on, little Metallica, but then I always do some Paganini and some Isai, and I use it almost a bait and switch, like, hey, come hear some rock music on the violin, but discover that serious classical music is every bit as exciting, and hey, come to the symphony show this weekend and here's a ticket discount. So I've always done that kind of thing as a way to bring classical music to more listeners, and not as sort of an end in itself. Nothing against crossover artists, and there are some brilliant ones out there, but that's not kind of where my particular passion lies. And so I don't consider this to be a crossover concerto. It's like the Bruch Scottish Fantasy, or any of these Dvorak with the Czech folk music, right? Any of these concertos that have drawn upon the popular or traditional music of their time and place. So many classical pieces that have jazz inspiration. So this is what's really cool about this, of course, is that heavy metal is a genre heavily indebted to classical music. A lot of the great guitarists, practiced their Paganini caprices, or even Kreutzer etudes in the case of Van Halen. They list, if you talk to, gosh, I have so many stories hanging out with the drummer from Slayer, and he showed me his iPod full of Berlioz, Rachmaninoff, and Liszt, or talking to the then lead guitarist of Megadeth, Marty Friedman, and talking about the Isai sonatas and the Mozart Sinfonia Concertante, or the lead singer of Iron Maiden always talks about, really listening to opera. So there's a lot of that in there. And then to bring it full circle and have the classical inspired by the metal, which was inspired by the classical, it just feels like something that was waiting to happen, but really expanding classical's boundaries, and not some kind of, cheesy rock and roll violin concerto or something. What's been, I think, the most exciting to me is actually how many listeners have heard the Maneein concerto who have no background whatsoever in heavy metal music, and yet they love it as a piece of music, as a piece of classical music, and that's been really exciting to see.
And as well as all you've described, the second movement begins with this almost elegiacally lyrical style that by the end there's a sort of cadenza that feels almost raw in its visceral playing, but it does take us on the full journey through what a classical work can achieve and can do en route to these other areas you're talking about.
Absolutely. And it's always fun to listen to classical with some of my fellow heavy metal aficionados, because you'll get to something like the slow movement of the Chanson Concerto for string quartet, violin, and piano, or the slow movement of Beethoven Symphony No. 7. And right away, those guys will be like, that movement is totally metal. So there's something about a dirgy, dark, really I don't even know the right adjectives, but there are certain slow movements that feel metal. Metal is not just fast, fast, fast.
No, it's absolutely fascinating, and it's a really, really wonderful work. So Rachel Barton Pine's new album, Dependent Arising, featuring Shostakovich's Violin Concerto No. 1 and a new work written for her by Earl Maneein called Dependent Arising, is available from today on the Cedille label. Rachel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. And of course, it's always great to get to collaborate with one of my very favorite UK orchestras. And so I'm so happy that you're highlighting them as well.
Yeah, it's a really wonderful album, and I'm sure people will be fascinated, but ultimately incredibly struck when they listen to it. So thank you again.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to this Gramophone podcast, which this week is produced in association with the Lake George Music Festival, where from August the 6th to the 17th you can enjoy classical music among some of America's most spectacular scenery. Visit lakegeorgemusicfestival.com to find out more. If you've enjoyed this Gramophone podcast, we'd be hugely grateful if you could leave a rating or a review, hit the subscribe button, or simply tell your friends about our work. And if you want to explore classical music in even greater depth with Gramophone, then we produce a monthly magazine packed full of interviews, features and reviews, and all listeners to this podcast can get a 20% discount by visiting gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and entering podcast 20 at the checkout. Thank you for listening, and do join us again for another Gramophone podcast next week.